Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our conference entitled Christians, Violence and the Middle East, which actually is the second installment of a conference series revolving around an ongoing research project conducted by the researchers of the Danube Institute. The research project, headed by Jeffrey Kaplan, is called Violence Against Christian Communities and Institutions. Unfortunately, the president of the Danube Institute, John O'Sullivan, cannot attend today's event because he is in London, and executive director István Kis has been taken ill. So now I would like to ask Jeffrey Kaplan to take the floor and open the conference. Professor Kaplan is a distinguished visiting fellow at the Danube Institute who inspires and coordinates the work of our research group being involved in this project. Professor Kaplan is a renowned expert of the field and puts a lot of effort into its research. Please welcome him to the floor.
Good morning to you all, and thank you for joining us for our conference. Christians' Violence in the Middle East is the second in a series of international conferences focused on our project, Attacks on Christian Communities and Institutions. The project is complex and global in scope, and I will offer greater details during the academic panel at 13:30 this afternoon. In brief, the project will undertake a program of in-depth, fieldwork-based research in 10 countries based on interviews with victims, government officials, on-site NGOs, churches, and when possible, perpetrators of the violence. It is this dimension that I believe distinguishes our project. What further distinguishes the project is our methodology. The decisive methodological base upon which this project is built may be actually attributed to a comment by State Secretary Tristan Azbej at a previous conference. Discussing the work of Hungary Helps, he recalled being accused by an EU official of, quote-unquote, weaponizing Christianity. As a security scholar, the terminology was irresistible, and I must admit to plagiarizing it constantly when I talk about the topic. But while this accusation is in essence an ideological attack, it does reflect a problem with the study of violence against Christians that plays no small part in the marginalization of our research. The problem is this: search on Google or Google Scholar, and it will demonstrate that much of what is out there, be it academic, NGO, or government-based, invariably uses the term Christian persecution in their titles or abstracts. Yet the actual definition of the term persecution is quite specific, and in fact, it fits only a small percentage of the violence perpetrated against Christians and their communities. The overuse of the terminology plays into the hands of those who dismiss the studies as biased. Others go further, asking, quote, how can Christians be persecuted when they are by definition persecutors? The Attacks on Christian Communities and Institutions research, therefore, posits three specific forms of violence against Christians. First is internecine violence, which refers to violence which occurs within a single faith community. It is perpetrated by either dissidents or competing sectarian groups. Communal violence refers to violence perpetrated by different faith communities or by dissident or sectarian factions of different faith communities. This is the most common form of religious violence. Christian persecution refers to violence undertaken by the state, either on a national, regional, or local level. This is the rarest form of violence against Christian communities, although given the vastly superior resources of government actors and the almost complete impunity with which they may act, this is the most dangerous form of Christian violence. Finally, there is a gray area in which governments may act through proxies or covertly support one side or the other. This is the most challenging, difficult, and frankly dangerous part of this kind of research. From an academic perspective, violence against Christians, their communities and institutions, is perhaps the least researched form of religio-political violence in the world today. By contrast, there is a massive research into anti-Semitism, including dedicated journals, think tanks, NGOs, and there is no shortage of funding sources with which to conduct this research. Islamophobia is far less researched, but it is a growing multidisciplinary field with research conducted on a global scale. By contrast, violence against Christians enjoys none of these advantages and suffers from a severe dearth of resources. The reasons for this lacuna are complex and best left to the discussion this afternoon. I would therefore like to turn to what this research is not. Our project does not seek to replicate the work of NGOs focused on violence against Christians. We have NGO representatives at this conference, and in our last conference, we had David Curry, the president and CEO of Open Doors, perhaps the largest and most influential of the NGOs focused on violence against Christians worldwide. Their work is vital and it's important, but their work is not ours. NGOs like Open Doors tell a particular truth, and they seek to be the voice of the voiceless, the victims of religious and sectarian violence. We have neither the resources nor the mission to replicate this important work. Rather, our goals are first to examine all facets of anti-Christian violence: sectarianism, tribalism, clan and familial conflict, bigotry, xenophobia, competition for resources, and a myriad of other factors that have come down through 2 millennia of history. We seek to speak to all involved in the violence, including, where possible, the perpetrators. This does not suggest a moral equivalence between perpetrator and victim, but rather an effort to comprehend the full picture of the strife impacting a particular nation or religion or region. In this research, as in all of the research which I have undertaken in the last 30 plus years, the ability to see the world through the eyes of the other, of all others, is the hallmark of a successful research project. This demands of our researchers the ability to put aside, for the duration of the research, preconceived assumptions and deeply held beliefs, so as to better comprehend the roots and full implications of the violence we have undertaken to study. For research to have value, lasting value to scholars, policymakers, and governments alike, its findings must reflect the data and not the predetermined outcomes that the researchers expect to find. This is a point to which we'll return in a moment. Our goals are first to leave a historical record. Second, we hope to provide policymakers a best practices set of approaches that will not only illuminate the roots of the conflict, but also will suggest the most fruitful paths towards the amelioration or cessation of the violence. Religious reconciliation is a long-term process that is ultimately the objectives of researchers, NGOs, and governments alike. But the reconciliation is impossible in a state of chaos, where conflict and violence fester unchecked. The first step is to restore the rule of law. And in places like the Middle East, the area that I know best from many, many years of living and working in the region, it is to help restore the traditional amity based on a system of checks and balances that have been disrupted now for generations. It is our hope that the fruits of this research will, through a value-neutral fieldwork-based approach, begin to suggest pathways towards achieving a cessation of the violence that threatens to become multi-generational in nature. By presenting a multifaceted picture that takes into account all sides of the conflict, it is hoped that this research and others like it will be a first step towards protecting Christian and indeed all communities. For make no mistake, religious violence never takes place in a vacuum. An attack on one faith today sows the seeds of an attack on another faith tomorrow. The relentless logic of religious violence is zero-sum in nature. That is, violence in one area against one faith will invariably draw a response elsewhere. Violence thus spreads and escalates, and today's victims become tomorrow's perpetrators. The examples are many in the Middle East, in Africa, and indeed, as the war in former Yugoslavia, no less than the religious violence taking place in many Western cities well illustrates, in the EU as well. Finally, there is this. Let me close with an example much closer to home of the importance of allowing the data rather than the researcher's own ideology or preconceptions to determine the outcome of the research. When I arrived in Hungary in 2019, I was absolutely convinced, based on Western media and academia, that Hungary was beset by anti-Semitic violence, a violence that was encouraged actively or tacitly by Fidesz and the Orban government. My Hungarian colleagues at the Danube Institute argued that this was not the case, and if anything, the opposite was true. Out of this clash of perceptions came our last project, Anti-Semitism in Hungary, Persecution and Reality. Over the next 2 years, we interviewed the leaders of all the disparate factions of the Hungarian community, as well as academic specialists in Hungary and abroad, Jewish journalists, activists, representatives of NGOs focused on anti-Semitism in Hungary, Israel, and the US. The research included convening an international conference which brought together, to the surprise of one and all, the leaders of the factions of the rather contentious Hungarian Jewish community, the Hungarian government, and academic and religious experts from the EU, Israel, and the US. The findings of the research can be found in a 2-volume set of books published by the Helena Historical Press in the United States. These findings came as a shock to me. For it found that while they were divided on the politics and policies of the Orban government, all agreed that life for Jews was infinitely better in Hungary than elsewhere in the EU. This was attributed to the government's imposition of a zero tolerance policy on public expressions of anti-Semitism, its support both politically and economically of the Jewish community, and its determination to build a new Holocaust museum, the House of Fates, and much more. The violence and fear that arose from Jobbik's rise to prominence a decade ago, and the violence of its associated paramilitary group, the Hungarian Guard, which the Orban government outlawed in 2009, are things of the past. In fact, there has been only one act of anti-Semitic violence in Hungary in the last 3 years. A record that stands in stark contrast to the violence that's all too common in other EU cities, and in the US as well. Indeed, a study announced at the meeting of the European Jewish Association, which was held in Budapest this summer, found that the 2 best countries for Jews to live in, based on quality of life and security of the Jewish community today, are Italy and Hungary. These were the findings which we published, based not on our opinions or the views of the Hungarian government, but on the interviews with Hungarian Jewish leaders, more than a dozen of which, with their permission, are published verbatim in the 2nd volume of Anti-Semitism in Hungary, Perceptions and Realities. Clearly, my own Western perceptions of Hungary were quite different from the realities of Hungary. And the fact that our conclusions were purely based on the data and supported by the words of the leaders of the Hungarian Jewish community itself will make the volumes the authoritative historical record of the contemporary Jewish community in Hungary for many years to come. What the outcomes of the attacks on Christian communities and institutions research will be, I do not as yet know. So far, we have conducted research in only one country, Poland, where we examined the emergence of internecine violence through interviews with all sides of that conflict. But we will follow the data and go wherever the data leads. Finally, thank you for your attention to this overlong introduction. And I want to end by thanking very sincerely the people who actually made this conference possible. Their work was incredible to get all of you here and to make sure that this conference went off as scheduled. They are Sharon Sugar, Lydia Pop, Jofi Totpiro, Doreen Adosha, and Wael Taj Miller. Thank you to you, and thank you to you all.
Now, I would like to kindly ask Tristan Azbej, State Secretary for the Aid of Persecuted Christians, to deliver his keynote address. State Secretary, please take the floor.
Good morning, dear fathers, professors, Mr. Director, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank the Danube Institute for inviting me here today so that I can talk about the policy field I'm in charge of in the Hungarian government, but at the same time I can talk about my vocation and mission. And I'm really delighted to stand in front of you because as I look around in this audience, I see many longtime friends, partners and allies who excel in their professional career and life, but about whom I know that they also are looking at the issue of combating persecuted Christians as a personal vocation. So it is really good to be among such strong allies. And also, I would like to commend the Danube Institute for being persistent about doing independent research work on reality. And second, once they have their findings, to be courageous enough to talk about that reality that has been found. Today, in this post-factual world dominated by wokeism, it takes courage to talk about actual research and funding and about the reality of those groups who are often overlooked, who are discriminated, such as persecuted Christians in the world. And I have arrived with very fresh experiences and memories about raising awareness for the persecuted Christian cause, because recently I had the honor of visiting Pope Francis in the Vatican. I was accompanying President Katalin Novak. And when I introduced myself, referring to what we do in Hungary Helps Program, the Holy Father were definitely reassuring the Hungary Helps Program of his approval and agreement. And I had a very similar and very striking and dramatic experience when I was able to greet the Holy Father briefly in Mosul during the papal visit to Iraq in March 2021. Then our local church partners introduced me to the Holy Father. Let me be personal about this and tell you this story. So I knew from our church partners in Iraq that I was able to going to speak to the Holy Father in person. You know, in this case, you have a few sentences to explain what you do and what your work is. And I was standing in front of Pope Francis in Mosul, and I was starting to tell him my prepared speech about, my elevated speech about the Hungary Helps Program. Then the Syriac Catholic bishop of Mosul intervened and summarized it in one sentence. He said that, Holy Father, if it weren't for some Catholic charity organizations and the Hungarian government who came to assist us in 2016, then there would be no Christian presence in Iraq. And at that time, it was very unusual. So when Pope Francis mentioned this, what he has learned in Iraq, learning about all the important work that charity organizations do, and also what the Hungarian government has done. One thing that came as a result is that the next day he announced that he would visit Hungary, which he did last year, but also the fact that a government can have a program for persecuted religious minorities created attention, so we could raise awareness this way. So there in Mosul, history became tangible, because there are only few places where the power of history is felt as much as in the Middle East, which is the regional scope of this conference. Once upon a time, one of the cradles of human civilization rocked here. The first great powers, one of the first written memories and scientific achievements were born here. And at the beginning of the 21st century, the 2003 Iraq War, then the events referred to as the Arab Spring, and finally the Islamic State's occupation of the Middle East signaled and initiated changes that disrupted regional, social, ethnic, and religious relations. In particular, the wave of terror unleashed by the Islamic State has awakened the world to realize the extent of the danger the Christian communities are exposed to. This situation triggered the Hungarian government's thinking and especially its actions. Ladies and gentlemen, following his meeting with Middle Eastern church leaders at the end of the summer of 2016, the Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán personally considered it important for Hungary to take action. The Hungarian government has decided not to stand idle by and not to ignore the genocidal persecution of Christians in some regions of the world. We were the first to raise the cause of persecuted Christians to the rank of state policy. At this point, I would like to note that Hungary was the first to move to elevate this as a government program. We never claimed to be the only ones, only as a government. And here I would like to thank all our partner institutions, all the charity organizations, and all the advocates of this cause for showing us the way and teaching us how to best reach persecuted Christian minorities. Ever since we have started the Hungary Helps Program, we maintain a continuous and strong relationship with the leaders of the communities suffering persecution. With the launch of the Hungary Helps Program in 2016, action against Christian persecution became part of our national mission. So it became more than a government policy. It became part of the Hungarian national ethos, the Hungarian national vocation. This is why we provide humanitarian aid to the world's regions affected by war, terror, and crisis. We are aware that the persecution of Christians in the world is one of the biggest and most concealed human rights crises of our time. Christians are persecuted and oppressed not only in the Middle East but also in many other regions. The latest research on the persecution of Christians in the world reports alarming facts. The number of persecuted and threatened people grows every year and now exceeds 340 million Christians. Still, there are those, mainly in the Western world, but also in Hungary, who don't accept these facts, or just are indifferent about it. Those who denied this tragic reality claim that the persecution of Christians have ended once and for all in AD 313. Moreover, they propose an alternative reality where the victims are the persecutors. The strange self-hatred of Western civilization is behind that, which is partially fueled by the guilt caused by the colonial past and partially by the arrogance which aims to completely erase the past, the identities, relegate traditions to the background and eradicate them. From the beginning, we considered it our task to acknowledge the fact of Christian persecution to the world and to advocate international cooperation in two ways. One, the protection of religious freedom of Christians and other groups, and the support of the institutions of Christians in the Middle East who have suffered a lot. Ladies and gentlemen, the Middle East is emblematic in this respect. Not only because it was the cradle of civilizations, not only because it is the cradle of the three monotheistic world religion, but because it is a region that has shown both examples of coexistence and hatred throughout history. That area where Christianity is the most threatened today. In addition to death threats and armed conflicts, immigration weakens the Christian communities there the most. In recent decades, papal guidelines have repeatedly warned against the Holy Land becoming a kind of museum. in the absence of living Christian communities. But this is also true for the entire Middle East. Christian communities in every country have provided and continue to provide an important and valuable contribution to society, to life, and to the development of these countries. Without them, the respective countries would be poorer. In times of crisis, the fate of a community can often depend on a single person. If a person works with determination and strong faith for the benefit of the community, enormous efforts can be achieved. We sought out these key players, so-called, these people, church leaders, when the Hungary Helps Program was launched, so that the Hungarian aid would reach its destination. Something that is important for our program, we don't provide our aid through major, big international organizations. We provide our aid directly. It goes from the Hungarian state to the church communities. And the reason for that, we are not aiming to support big multilateral organizations. We want to reach the most vulnerable communities. And to this day, we maintain dialogue directly with these church partners in order to know as precisely as possible the fate of these communities, how we may help them, especially when it comes to the Syrian, Iraqi, and Lebanese communities. And of course, we also want to know the effects and results of our aid. Our standpoint is clear. Help should be taken where the trouble is. It is not the trouble and problems that should be transferred to other places. Our standpoint stems from our own experience. Our most important aspiration has always been to remain Hungarian in our homeland. We wish the same for the Hungarians living abroad in minority. And we wish the same for all other national, ethnic, and religious minorities in the world, that they can remain and live in peace in their homeland. In addition to peace and physical security, the prerequisites for staying in one's homeland are freedom of religion and equality of citizenship. It is important that Christians do not find themselves in a disadvantageous situation simply because their religion is different from that of the majority of the society of their country. At the same time, it is not enough merely to realize individual legal equality. After all, a significant part of the rights is experienced in community. This is the case not only with language rights, to which we are particularly sensitive as Hungarians, but also with the right to freedom of religion. After all, religious practice certainly has a community dimension. For example, customs and regulations related to worship are celebrating holidays, but also education. This is not necessarily covered by the provision of individual legal equality alone. Therefore, the implementation of the community aspects of religious freedom, both at the legal and practical level, is also essential in our view. Observing the effects of the war raging near us in Ukraine, these observations support that it was important that we have started many of our projects helping persecuted Christians while the crisis was still ongoing, more than a half decade ago. And we can already see the effects of these actions, the effects that unfortunately couldn't help to restore fully these communities, but at least provide a hope, a shining, a flickering light for survival. Our projects include, for example, the restoration of a hospital in Aleppo, Syria, the reconstruction of the settlement of Tel Askuf in Iraq, or the support for the restoration of more than 60 churches in Lebanon, which are extremely important for the revival of local communities. Hungarian aid might be a drop in the ocean, but it might also be a drop that can save the life of a person. We are proud of the friendship of the Middle Eastern Christian communities and their church leaders. We sincerely thank our supporters for their active partnership, but also for their prayers. We have been spiritually enriched by their partnership and friendship. So with this, I would like to wish you all a successful conference, and I want to say thank you once again for the organizers and for partnership. May God bless us all. May God bless the persecuted Christians. Thank you for your attention.